Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Friday, July 14, 2024, Flag Day here in America. I wish the flag stood for what it originally stood for. We'll get into still stood for it. We'll get into that in a little bit. It's our favorite time of the week and our favorite time of the day. It's the end of the week. It's the Intelligence Community Roundtable with my dear friends and colleagues, Ray McGovern and Larry Johnson. Let's start, please, with the breaking news of the day, which is an offer for a ceasefire in Ukraine by President Putin. And rather than describing it, we'll listen to it ourselves. I think it's cut number 3, Chris.
The West is ignoring our interests and at the same time forbidding Kiev to negotiate, all the while hypocritically calling us to some kind of negotiations. It just seems foolish. Ukrainian troops must be fully withdrawn from Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and from the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. And I draw your attention to the fact that it includes the entire territory of these regions within their administrative borders, as they existed when they joined Ukraine. Once Kiev declares its readiness and starts the genuine withdrawal of its troops from these areas, as well as officially notify about the abandonment of plans to join NATO, our side will immediately, literally at the same minute, follow the order to cease fire and start negotiations.
Couldn't Zelensky have had this deal or even a better one before the first shot was fired, Ray McGovern?
He had a much better one, Judge. What surprises me is that the Russians weren't all over that. In other words, when that preliminary agreement was sealed in March and April of 2022, 6 weeks after the special military operation or invasion of Ukraine, it was clear what the Russians would settle for: neutrality for Ukraine, no membership in NATO, and a ceasefire, and they would talk about these other things later. That was initial, okay? Now, the Russians didn't really explicate that, didn't really say, well, this was done until Putin was meeting with African leaders in August of 2022. And since then, we've had Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister. We've had Schröder from Germany. We've had Erdogan from Turkey. They all attest to the fact this was all set until Boris Johnson came in and said, no, you can't do that. If you do that, we won't give you the wherewithal to defeat the Russians. And that was a crazy idea to begin with. Obama himself having said in 2016, there's no way that Ukraine can beat Russia, and we shouldn't give them the idea that they can prevail over what Obama called a much more powerful Russia. So this has been known for a while. There are lots of dribs and drabs. Some of the Ukrainian negotiators, for God's sake, the people that were negotiating with the Russians in first Belarus and then in Istanbul, they've come out and said exactly what was involved. And the Russians have spelled out chapter and verse, all the codicils and everything else. Even the Wall Street Journal had the essence of this thing 6 weeks ago. Will the U.S. media play this? Will they tell the truth to the U.S. people? Well, I'm not holding my breath.
Larry, your thoughts on President Putin and on the timing of it, Larry, given who's meeting in Geneva next week and the likely futility of all of that?
It goes back to what we've said several times on your show. The West needs to listen to what Putin says. He's not bluffing. He's not some empty-headed politician just talking to be talking. So the Ukrainians have had this is their fourth opportunity to make a deal. The first was Minsk 1, didn't go. Minsk 2 didn't go. In fact, Minsk 2 was cynically designed by Germany and France to just buy time for Ukraine to build up militarily. And then the peace process that Ray just described. So now Putin's laying it out. Here's what we want. You can stop it here, because notice in there he's not making a demand about Odessa. So Odessa is still off the table. And if the West would come in and now negotiate and agree to his terms, keep Ukraine out of NATO, cede the existing territory that's now under Russian, most of which is under Russian control, to Russia, remove their troops, then, Odessa might stay as part of Ukraine. But the Ukrainians aren't going to accept this. So this is a prelude to the next ramp up in Russian military operations. That's what you're going to see.
Can we three agree, Ray, you first, that this is not aimed at Zelensky? This is aimed at Biden, Blinken, and Sullivan.
Yeah, they can't afford to do anything that might impede their re-election chances, and that's the overwhelming majority. That's the reality here. I'm glad that Larry mentioned Odessa. I'm glad that he noticed that too. Now, in October of 2022, Putin, at the end of one of these long Q&As, said, Odessa. Oh, you're asking, the questioner, you want to go to Odessa and you wonder whether you should apply for a Ukrainian or a Russian passport? Oh, how clever your question. Well, let me tell you, Odessa can be, what do you call it? A yabloko, razdor. Yabloko is apple, okay? Razdor is discord. Go back to the Trojan War. It can be an apple of discord.
Iris, the goddess of discord. She sent an apple in and said, for the fairest. It started the Trojan War.
Right. So that, and then he said, or it can be a way of reconciling different points of view and moving toward a resolution to this kind of crisis. Now, as you know, Judge, because it's not the first time I mentioned this, I thought that was something that they ought to be aware of and they ought to pick up on. I doubt whether Biden was ever apprised of this offer, but now, as Larry points out, Odessa is not ruled out. Odessa could, in my view, become a kind of international city, or most people don't believe this. Now, Larry and I are maybe outliers here, but the fact that Odessa and even Kharkov, they can deal on that. The Russians don't want to take over cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. Why would they want to do that if they could do it in a different way?
Larry, the reason I suggest that this is aimed at the Americans is because Putin's not going to negotiate with Zelensky. Zelensky has no legal authority. I can't imagine them unlike Joe Biden, who accepts his signature on a 10-year pact. I can't imagine the Russians accepting Zelensky's signature on anything, Larry.
Well, no, you're correct. But what Putin is doing is putting it out there for the Ukrainian Rada, the elements in the military that are still coherent. And so he would be willing to sit down with an appropriate Ukrainian authority. But it would be somebody like the president of the Rada, their legislature. Or it would be with General Sersky, or there are rumors afoot that Zaluzhny is going to be brought back. But definitely, you're right. He's not going to deal with Zelensky, and Zelensky's already, he would be, again, violating more Ukrainian laws if he talked to the Russians, because they passed a law saying he can't talk to the Russians.
Right. Ray, what is your view of Putin's intention by sending Russian warships and a very powerful submarine into Havana Harbor, where they were greeted with a 21-gun military salute?
Judge, it was just 62 years ago when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. This brings all that back to memory of those who have been around that long, okay? Now, there is information. This kind of visit was planned a long time ago. But the publicity attendant to it now, and the fact that the Russians are now saying, we can respond asymmetrically, we can respond symmetrically. Well, in my view, all you have to do is go back to 62, and you see this is a very symmetrical response, given what happened in 62. And I'm not saying the Russians are going to more than just threaten, but it doesn't make any sense for those warships to be there without the appropriate armaments that they carry. And despite all the denials that there are no nuclear weapons on those ships, I suspect there are.
Larry, the agreement that Presidents Biden and Zelensky signed in southern Italy earlier today, is it anything more than a political stunt?
Yeah, that's all it is. This is more for the American body politic to digest, to pretend that we're going to be supporting Ukraine. Ukraine, frankly, I'm not even sure that the Ukraine we know today won't exist in a year. It'll be gone. It remains to be seen what is left of that Ukraine. Zelensky won't be around in 10 years. Biden won't be around in 10 years, that's for sure. So this was really a meaningless declaration. It's almost like it's designed to try to poke another finger in the eye of Russia. Oh yeah, we're going to be here for 10 years, and the Russians go, okay, you are declaring war on us. That's how Russia views this, as Pepe Escobar described on your program yesterday.
What is your take, Larry? What is your take on the presence of this armada, the small armada? I guess armada is the wrong word. 4 or 5 heavy-duty ships and a very significant submarine, literally a stone's throw from Key West, Florida.
Sure. It's just Western media reading more into it than is there. They did the same thing. The Russians did the same thing a year ago, in July 7th, I believe.
I don't even think that made the media then.
Oh, no. It made the media a year ago, but, they're like Joe Biden. They forget what they did yesterday. So, what's going on here is, yes, the Russians had this pre-planned, as Ray pointed out, but they also can send some diplomatic messages to the United States. It's a reminder to say, hey, we can reach out and touch you. We can do to you what you've been doing for us. I mean, as I wrote the other day about the fact that the United States from from the summer of 2007 up through 2021 was conducting annual naval exercises with U.S. ships in the Black Sea that included things like having U.S. Marines land on Ukrainian beaches. Now, if the Russians had been conducting exercises for 15, 16 years in Mexico with Russian troops landing on Mexican beaches, do you think we'd have a problem with that?
Sure would.
By God, we absolutely be out of our minds.
Ray, I'm going to ask you about this woman, Fiona Hill, whom I recall from one of Donald Trump's impeachments. But before we do, you'll appreciate this. This is a short clip from Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama, when I asked him his views of the State Department and the mess they've made in Ukraine. Number 14, Chris.
Every decision Jake Sullivan and Secretary Blinken have made, along, I guess, with Joe Biden, has been wrong. They'll make a decision not to do something, and then they'll change their mind and go back to it. It has absolutely been amazing to me as somebody that's kind of an outsider looking at this situation going, do you know when to stop? I mean,
Right.
Just stop making decisions. Somebody go and sit down with Vladimir Putin and get this thing over with and quit killing people.
Get this thing over it and quit killing people. Ray, first your thoughts on Senator Tuberville, and then your thoughts on this woman, Fiona Hill, and why she says we should be fighting in Ukraine, and remind us who she is or who she was.
Yeah, well, I have to say that Tuberville makes sense, but he's addressing the symptoms here. This is not about Ukraine. It's about weakening Russia. It's about our inept Secretary of Defense saying more than a year and a half ago, we're going to move heaven and earth to make sure that Russia has a strategic defeat in Ukraine. He said that. He said that from the podium. He said that in a very ostentatious way. Well, They ain't going to be able to do that. That's for sure. And what the Russians are doing now with this little fleet that they've put down near Havana is showing, well, look, we have capabilities now that we never had before. We developed them, and now, Washington is within 4 or 5 minutes if we decide to shoot a Zircon missile or some other hypersonic missile. So it's kind of missing the whole point, is what I'm saying. And with respect to Fiona Hill, well, I would say that even Putin, about a month ago, he said, there are no Russian specialists anymore in the United States. Now, there are some, but they were all trained by people like Richard Pipes, inveterate Russophobe, and that includes Fiona Hill. You go to Harvard, you learn about how bad the Russians are. So what she wrote exactly a month before the special military operation is something to behold. It was the New York Times, and what it said is, Putin wants to take over Western Europe. Who's saying that now? Biden still, okay, wants to take over Western Europe. He wants to say to the United States and Europe, okay, get out of here and don't let the door hit you on the way out. So that was January 24th, 2022. Later, she was forced to admit about the Istanbul Accords. She and one of her colleagues in Foreign Affairs said, we learned this, that they were quite close to concluding this thing for a ceasefire and no admission for Ukraine into NATO. And then something happened, and wow, this is, we know what happened. We don't need all this testimony from people involved. Read Ukrainskaya Pravda, for God's sake, in April of 2022. It's all right out there. Boris Johnson came in and said, don't deal with the Russians. We're going to give you all this sophisticated stuff. You're going to beat the pulp out of them. Just trust us. And that's what the Ukrainians did.
Larry, is Russia preparing for a land war against NATO?
Russia has been prepared for a land war with NATO. It's NATO who's not prepared for a land war with Russia. It's the equivalent of the NATO and America. We keep talking about, oh yeah, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and it's like a fat guy that sits in a chair saying, you know what, I'm going to do the Ironman competition next week, which means I'm going to have to bike 100 miles. I'm going to run 26 miles and swim 2 miles. But he hasn't done any exercise, and he doesn't even have any equipment to wear to carry out such a task. That's the West. Whereas Russia, that's why they have built up their army now. At the whole start of the special military operation, I think their actual force structure was about 650,000. They've doubled it. They're at 1.3 million now. Compare and contrast that with the United States, which has 455,000 active duty soldiers. So it's not even a contest. And within that, you've already had Turkey say, if you're going to war with Russia, count us out. We're not there. Hungary, the same. So, the West doesn't even have the force structure that would be required to do something so stupid. So it's idle talk.
Is Putin expecting, Ray McGovern, American troops on the ground in Ukraine?
I don't believe so, but he would not be surprised, and he's willing to deal with them. I mean, he's made clear that if Western troops, no matter if they're NATO troops or at least from countries that belong to NATO, they will be destroyed. I think that's the only thing that Biden has resisted doing so far. I hope it continues in this frame of mind, because that would, there would be body bags brought back openly to Dover once that happened. Putin is playing a clever game here. There is a peace conference, a charade of a peace conference taking place in Geneva tomorrow and the next day. All people were invited to it. It's Zelensky's initiative, and what he wanted to do is sell himself as a continuing leader, legal leader of Ukraine, and to say, well, look, my proposal is on the table here. This is the one we have to endorse. Makes no sense at all. It means Russia abject defeat, pays war reparations, and goes to jail, these kinds of things. So here's Putin coming in now, just 2 days now, 1 day before that conference starts, and said, look, this is a realistic thing on the table. We have the upper hand. Take it or leave it, okay? If you leave it, he's very explicit. He says more people will die, and the terms for an agreement will be even more disadvantageous to you all. We're going to attrition. So take it or leave it. That's what's on the table. And that's the only realistic option on the table, except there's an election year, for God's sake. And I have no confidence that our leaders will do the sensible thing.
Larry, were you surprised when Pepe Escobar told us the other night that Vladimir Putin, President Putin, was in North Korea?
Yeah, I didn't know that. But what we've seen over the last 2 weeks is a decided shift in the words coming out of Moscow, both by Putin, by Lavrov, by Rybkov, the deputy foreign minister. There has been a decided shift because of what they're seeing as the growing hostility from the West. And I think as they sit and assess it, what they see is growing instability in the West because it's not predictable. When you look at the likes of Macron and Rishi Sunak and Olaf Scholz, who just got hammered in elections, and then Joe Biden, who, he's wandering off. It's just, he makes, he's like the retarded man in the Peter Sellers comedy about Chauncey Gardner, who was, sort of became president at some point. I mean, Biden makes Chauncey Gardner look like Einstein. And so if you're the Russians, you got to sit back and worry, what kind of decision making? I mean, they're asking the same questions we are. Who is making these decisions? And on what basis? What is guiding? What is the U.S. goal? What's its objective here? And all they can conclude is the United States wants to destroy Russia. And the Russians go, okay, if that's their game, we're going to respond, and we're going to prevent that from happening.